Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. It's about lunchtime on Saturday. I'm, like many, looking forward to the boxing tonight. Looking forward to the Frank Warren card at the Copper Box. Looking forward, of course, to Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Vasyl Lomachenko. I may actually come out of retirement from doing live commentary, and I may do a bit of live commentary later on some of the Frank Warren undercard fights. So if you'd be interested in that, definitely remember to keep an eye open later, probably around 6:30, 7 o'clock tonight. We may do a live stream. I've been catching up on a bit of the boxing this morning. One of the things that I saw was Luis Ortiz's return fight against Daniel the Mountain Martz. Now, few heavyweight fans will remember Daniel Martz, probably most notably for being wiped out by Joseph Parker in a fight that wasn't in the too distant past, as when Parker was coming up. He was brought in as a late notice opponent for the returning Luis Ortiz. Now, I don't want this video to be about performance enhancing drugs. That's been covered extensively elsewhere. But I will just say, so it's on record, that I was very uncomfortable with the return of Luis Ortiz. My take on the situation is, regardless of whether Luis Ortiz was or was not taking performance enhancing drugs, his excuse, his reasoning that he was taking some medication just didn't sit well with me personally. If he had been taking such medication, he ought to have declared them for the purposes of drug testing, and if he somehow forgot to declare that medication, having already had performance enhancing drugs issues earlier on in his career, then I think more fool him. I've got very, very limited sympathy for Luis Ortiz, and it pains me to see our sport in a place where the rules are just applied so inconsistently. You know, there are examples of fighters who have had the law come down on them very, very hard for performance enhancing drugs failures. Dillian Whyte banned from the sport for an extended period of time due to taking a pre-workout supplement. Yeah, Luis Ortiz was back, and he was back against the late notice Daniel Martz last night. And Luis Ortiz put the matter to bed in the second round. He dropped Martz heavily in the first round. And then he dropped Martz, when I say heavily, maybe that's an overstatement. He dropped Martz with body work in the first round. Very much that seemed to be his approach. Martz, very big, tall, rangy guy. Ortiz looked to close the gap, bank work to the body. In the second round, he timed Martz. It was a very, very, very well timed sort of straight punch, caught Martz on the chin, and Martz was knocked out very, very heavily. The referee waved it off, and Ortiz declared a winner in the second round. Despite winning a very, very one-sided fight in devastating fashion early, I actually didn't think this represented Luis Ortiz's best performance. I really do believe Luis Ortiz has lost a step, and that's no surprise given his age. But I think we've seen a decline in the David Allen fight, in the Malik Scott fight, and in this fight. And, you know, clearly he hasn't declined to a level where he's a useless fighter. I'm not suggesting that. But this is not the same Luis Ortiz who took out Tony Thompson or who took out Latif Coyote. For me, he's lost a step for that. We're seeing a Luis Ortiz who's slow, who's a bit wilder, who's finding a bit more trouble closing down the range. We're seeing a Luis Ortiz who really, for me, to be at his best, needs to be able to unload punches against stationary, flat-footed fighters. We're not seeing the same depth and quality of technical boxing from Ortiz that we used to see early on from his career. We're not seeing the same explosiveness and dynamicness in his punches that people who've been watching Luis Ortiz from, you know, his earlier days will have remembered. But nevertheless, you know, Ortiz took out a late notice journeyman opponent in the second round. I actually didn't like his conduct after the knockout, especially given some of the controversy that has surrounded him. He stood over. I don't think saying stood over is actually an exaggeration. He stood over his unconscious opponent and gesticulated wildly at Deontay, who was ringside commentating. Now, the referee actually made several attempts to try and push Luis Ortiz away from his position where he was standing over his injured and semi-unconscious opponent, but Ortiz was not for moving and continued to remonstrate. I thought that was a very bad look, I must admit, for someone who's had multiple issues with performance-enhancing drugs, and for someone who has just rendered an opponent completely unconscious in quite a chilling fashion. Rather than to check his opponent was okay, rather to make sure he wasn't celebrating over a man's body when that man could have potentially serious injuries. Instead, Ortiz decided to pretty much stand over for him and scream abuse at Deontay Wilder, who was ringside. Personally, I didn't think that was a very good look. Wilder then got into the ring and pretty much gave the indication that he was up for doing the fight, that he was up for having that match up again. Now, funnily enough, I've got a request video that I'm going to be filming in the next few days talking about unification fights that may not be happening. And that video is to include the fact that the Deontay Wilder-Anthony Joshua fight is not going to happen in the near future, in my personal opinion. So I won't focus on the fact in this particular video that Wilder-Joshua isn't happening. But what I will tell you is that it very much looked to me like Wilder-Ortiz is happening. Deontay Wilder was saying after the fight that he wants to fight a good fighter in Luis Ortiz because he wants to prove he's the best. And, I have some sympathy from that perspective for Deontay Wilder. My take is that despite the fact Deontay Wilder's resume is incredibly weak, despite the fact that Deontay Wilder has fought a very lowly level of opposition for such a long-term champion, my perception is that he does want to take the bigger fights and he does want to test himself. And I have some sympathy by the fact that he took the Povetkin fight and that he took the Luis Ortiz fight, and that those fights didn't happen under clouds of performance-enhancing drugs controversy. So, Wilder may look to take this fight. The difficulty with Luis Ortiz is, at this point, genuinely, I make Deontay Wilder a very big favourite over Luis Ortiz. And frankly, if Wilder had fought Luis Ortiz at the time that Luis Ortiz was taking out the Tony Thompsons or taking out the Bryant Jenningses of this world, I'd have probably gone the other way. I'd have probably said that Luis Ortiz would be the favourite. But I do believe that Luis Ortiz has lost a step. I do believe that he's slower. I do believe that at this point in his career, he struggles with opponents who have athleticism, speed, lateral movement. And I do think Deontay Wilder's a hell of a lot bigger than him. I think Deontay Wilder's got a vastly improved jab. I think he's very fast. I think he's very athletic. I think his movement has improved. And I think there is a real chance that Deontay Wilder could keep Luis Ortiz at the end of a stiff, painful jab, and that when Luis Ortiz does try to close the gap, Deontay Wilder could catch him from range. I think there's a distinct possibility. Luis Ortiz is dangerous. Luis Ortiz still poses a threat even at this stage of his career. He would be by far the best opponent that Deontay Wilder were to beat if Deontay Wilder was to be successful. But I do make Wilder a substantial favourite over Luis Ortiz at this point in his career. And it's a fight that for me will be interesting because it is a step up for Deontay Wilder, but it's a fight that even at this early stage I believe that I would pick Deontay Wilder to win. As for Luis Ortiz, he's in a position where he needs to be hurried. There's a lot of commentary in the boxing community about how old this guy actually is. Even if you look at his listed age, even if you look at the age of him on BoxRec, he's getting older, and he probably hasn't had big paydays in his career to date. There does appear to be a gradual decline starting to slip into his game. He's been inactive, he's barely fought apart from last night for a year or so. So Ortiz needs to move quickly, and possibly if this Deontay Wilder fight for him is there, he needs to take that matchup. He certainly has a puncher's chance. There are certainly elements of Wilder's game that still need developing, despite the fact that Wilder's a multiple world champion and Ortiz, sorry, not a multiple world champion, a multiple defence world champion, and Ortiz does have certain technical advantages over Deontay Wilder. Look, we'll put that fight to one side and we'll break that down in a much more detail if it is to be announced. But my take is that fight looks like happening. My take is that right here, right now, the AJ Wilder fight isn't going on. I don't think the Wilder-Parker fight is necessarily going to happen. And I guess when you start ruling those guys out, who are the best names in the sport? Well, Wilder's already had a substantial history with Povetkin. Understand there's a legal battle between the two, so that's not a fight that's happening anytime soon. Luis Ortiz probably does represent the best name, or certainly one of the top 2 or 3 names available to Deontay Wilder. So, that's my thoughts. I think that this fight is up next. I'm thinking Wilder is going to have what it takes to win that fight. And Ortiz is back. He showed that he's still got power. He showed that he's still able to put an opponent like Daniel Martz to the sword. But just looking at him, just looking at his pace, just looking at the way he tries to close down range, I don't think he's the same fighter he used to be. Am I being harsh? Let me know your thoughts. Leave me a comment in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please do take the time to hit the thumbs up button, which will get more visibility to it. Please do subscribe if you're new and haven't done so already, so you can check out all my other stuff. Lots of videos up on the channel this week. Got a preview of the Copper Box card with the Gale, Selby, Yard, Dubois. Got the Lomachenko Rigondo prediction up, so do check that one out. And as I said, we're going to try and do a bit of live commentary later if the stars align. Thanks again for watching, guys. Appreciate you tuning in.